Well, now, pull up a chair. Let the screen door slap shut behind you. The name's Earl McKenna. Folks around here say I've got more salt in my veins than blood, and after 70-odd years on this earth, 50 of 'em spent dancing with the Atlantic. I reckon they might be right. I've seen things out on that water that would make a preacher tear up his Bible, wonders that would make a poet weep, and horrors that would turn a young man's hair to snow. Some stories, you see, they ain't for the logbooks or the barstool bragging. They're for nights like this, when the tide's low and the air is still, and you can almost hear the ocean whisperin' its old secrets. This one still makes the hair on my arms stand up, even after all this time. It started on a day that felt like any other, but the sea, she had other plans. The sun was a pale lemon wafer in the sky that morning, not yet strong enough to burn through the stubborn coastal haze. It was the kind of day that feels suspended in time, where the only sounds the gentle slap of water at the hull and the lonely distant gull. I wasn't out for my boat, the Sea Spirit, a vessel as old and groaning as my own bones, was anchored in a place most sensible fishermen avoided. A secluded cove the old-timers had christened the Devil's Throat. The name fit. The cliffs on either side clawed at the sky like broken teeth, and the water within a deep, unseen color, the color of a bruised plum. The currents here were liars, pulling one way on the surface and another, far stronger, in the dark below. It was quiet, a deep, profound quiet soothed the soul. My only company was Buddy, a grizzled old dog with fur the color of sea foam, and I had held the wisdom of 1,000. He was lying on the bow, his head on his paws, letting out the occasional contented sigh that rumbled through the floorboard. Buddy and I, we understood each other without words. He was the keeper of my silence, and on that day, the silence was what I'd come for. We just sat, two old souls adrift, watching the world breathe. The air smelled of salt, of damp rock, and of the faint metallic tang of rust. Old secret clung to the cove. It was a peace you couldn't buy, a peace earned through years of listening more than you talk. That peace was shattered by the vulgar thrum of a powerful engine. It started as a distant annoyance and grew into an invasive roar that scraped against the tranquility of the cove. A boat, call it that, sliced through the mouth of the throat. It was one of those newfangled yachts, sterile white monster of fiberglass and chrome that looked more like a rich man's bathroom fixture than a seaworthy vessel. It cut through the water with an arrogant efficiency, leaving a wake that rocked the Sea Spirit with rude indifference. On its gleaming deck stood a group of people whose laughter didn't belong here. It was brittle, loud, hollow, the sound of people who look at the ocean and see only a backdrop for their photograph. At the helm was a man I'd seen around the marina, a city fella named Graham. He had that particular brand of confidence that comes from a life insulated by money. He wore a crisp white shirt, sunglasses that hid his eyes but not his smirk, and a gold watch that probably cost more than my boat. He steered his vessel into the center of the cove as if he owned it, the music from his speakers poisoning the air. Buddy lifted his head, a low growl vibrating in his chest. He didn't like them any more than I did. I just watched, my hand resting on the warm, worn wood of the tiller, feeling like an ancient tree watching a garish billboard being erected in its forest. They drank, they shouted, and they treated the sacred quiet of the place like an empty room to be filled with their own noise. Then I saw something that made the blood in my veins run cold with a quiet fisherman fury. One of the crew, on Graham's laughing command, dragged something heavy to the side of the yacht. It was the carcass of a deer, a beautiful buck by the looks of its half-grown antlers. Its fur was matted, its vacant eyes staring at nothing, a life given and taken, likely in some pointless sport, now to be treated as garbage. "Get rid of it!" Graham bellowed over the music, gesturing with a bottle of champagne. "Give the fish a free meal!" His friends roared with laughter. The crewman, a young lad who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, heaved the animal over the side. It hit the water with a wet, heavy slap that echoed off the cliffs. The sound was obscene. In the stillness, the carcass floated for a moment, a grotesque island of brown and white on the dark. Its legs splayed unnatural. Graham and his party cheered, raising their glasses. For a single held breath, nothing. The ripples from the impact spread out, lapping gently against my hull. The gulls that had been circling fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Buddy was on his feet now, his body rigid, the fur on his back standing up with brush. He wasn't barking. He was staring at the terrifying intensity I had never seen in him before. Then it happened. It wasn't a shark. I've seen 100 shark frenzies in my life. The violent thrashing, the tearing of flesh, the blood clouding the water. This was nothing. The water around the carcass didn't churn. It boiled in a perfectly defined circle, maybe 20 feet. The surface frothed, seethed with a silent, impossible violence. There was no splash, no fin, no sound of teeth on bone. It was as if a plug had pulled at the bottom of the world. The ocean itself was inhaling. 1. The deer was pulled under slightly, the water around it erupting in a foam as white as bone. 2. The carcass tilted vertically, antlers pointing to the sky for a heartbreaking second before being drawn down with incredible force. 3. It was gone, vanished, pulled under into the dark with a final guttural whoosh that seemed to come from the depths themselves. The water instantly stilled. The boiling ceased as quickly as it had begun. The surface became a sheet of dark glass once more, with not so much as a drop of blood or a scrap of hide to prove anything had ever been there. The silence that followed was a different kind. It wasn't peaceful. It was hungry. On the yacht, the music had been cut off. The laughter was dead. Graham and his friends stood frozen, their faces pale, slack-jawed with a disbelief that was quickly curdling into primal fear. Their expensive fun had been answered by something ancient and utterly unimpressed. Graham stared at the spot where the deer had been, his champagne bottle slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the deck. He barked an order, his voice a strained, high-pitched thing. The yacht's powerful engines roared back to life, no longer triumphant, but panicked. They turned the vessel around so fast it nearly swamped itself and fled from the devil's throat as if the devil himself were at their heels. I stayed. I couldn't move. My own hand, resting on the tiller, was trembling. Buddy was pressed against my leg, whining low in his throat. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, not from fear of being next, but from the sheer, mind-altering shock of what I had just witnessed. 50 years I'd read this water like a book. I knew its moods, its creatures, its rhythms. I knew the bite of a bluefish, the weight of a tuna, the shadow of a great white. I thought I knew it. In 3 seconds, I learned I hadn't even understood the alphabet. That wasn't an animal. An animal leaves a mark. An animal is messy. This was an event, a force, a disappearance. The sea had opened its throat and swallowed a sacrifice it had not been offered, but had taken all the same. I looked down at the dark, inscrutable water, the same water I had loved and respected my whole life, and for the first time I felt like a stranger. The old, familiar sea was suddenly a place of terrifying, unknown depths, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the evening air, that I would be back. I had to know, or maybe I had to be sure I didn't want to know at all. Sleep didn't come easy for a long while after that. Most nights, I'd be pulled from a shallow dream by the same image, clear, as if it were happening right in front of my eyes. That perfect, silent circle of boiling water. I'd seen the ocean in all its fury. I'd seen rogue waves rise, gray mountains and hurricanes that screamed like banshees, but all that noise and chaos, honest somehow. It was the raw power of nature showing its hand. This was different. This was quiet, surgical violence, a power so immense it had no need for display. It was the difference between a barroom brawler, a silent assassin. The brawler breaks the furniture. The assassin leaves nothing, body, cold. The devil's throat changed. It was no longer a sanctuary of quiet reflection. It became a question mark carved into the coastline, a place that drew me in with a morbid gravity. I started going back, not with fishing rods, but with a knot of cold dread in my gut. Buddy knew. The moment I'd steer the sea spirit towards the cove's narrow entrance, he'd start to whine, a low, miserable sound that came from deep in his. He'd leave his comfortable spot on the bow and press his body so hard against my legs I could feel him trembling. He'd stare at the shoreline, at the cliffs, anywhere, the dark, still water. His fear was a more honest compass than any I had on board. It told me I was heading into something wrong. My son, Owen, a good boy who worries I'll end my days as a piece of bait, had gifted me a fancy fish finder last Christmas, a top-of-the-line sonar unit with a screen that glowed in a dozen colors. I'd mostly ignored it, preferring to read the water with my eyes and gut, the way my father and his father taught me. To me, it was a fancy toy that tried to turn the sea's poetry into a bunch of green lines. But now, it was the only tool I had that could peer into the place I was suddenly too afraid to look. I motored to the exact spot where Graham's offering had been taken. The water was placid, giving away nothing. I switched on the sonar, the machine humming to life with a soft electronic pulse. The screen showed the familiar rocky bottom, a steep drop-off into a canyon I knew was there. Everything was normal. For half an hour, I watched the rhythmic sweep of the sonar beam paint the same mundane moment. Screen flickered. The hum of the machine hitched. A shadow, a smear of impossibly dense color, materialized at the very bottom of the canyon. It wasn't shaped like a whale or a submarine. It was mass, a colossal, undefined shape that absorbed the sonar signal like a black hole. It was the size of a small house, maybe bigger. My breath caught my throat. Before I could even process the reading, it was gone. The screen flickered again, and the bottom returned to normal. The boat's radio crackled with static for a second, then fell silent. It was as if the very presence of the thing had disrupted the laws. That single, fleeting image lit a fire in the dusty attic of my memory. It brought back the ghost of my granddad's voice, sitting on a porch much like this one, his pipe smoke curling into the twilight. He was a man who believed the sea had a memory, and he told stories that weren't for the tourist. He spoke of certain deep channels off the coast where things just went missing. Not storms, Earl, he'd say, his voice a low rumble. Not wrecks, just gone. Sometimes a lobster boat would pull up an anchor chain bitten clean in two. Said the old ones called them bottom shadows, things that swallowed anchors and didn't give a damn for steel. As a boy, I'd dismiss them as fish tales, the kind of spooky nonsense old salt spun to keep children from falling off the docks. Now, I wasn't so sure. My obsession became a quiet, methodical investigation. I spent days in the town's small maritime archives, blowing dust off old charts, shipping logs. I found a pattern of strange little incidents centered around the Devil's Throat, stretching back a century. A lighthouse keeper's report from 1922 about a signal buoy vanishing overnight. Its mooring chain, thick as a man's arm, found snapped on the seabed a week later. A fisherman's log from the 1950s noting that his heaviest crab pots, wired with steel cable, were being dragged into the deep and lost, not just pulled apart, but taken whole. These were the footnotes of history, the minor, unexplained events that people shrugged off because there was no easy answer. But now, they were all pointing in the same terrifying direction. The final piece of the puzzle came on a low afternoon. I was skirting the rocky edge of the cove, a place too treacherous. There, wedged in a crevice, bleached decades of sun and salt, were the skeletal remains. It was the Fiona's Folly, a boat that had belonged to a clammer named Reed, who disappeared 30 years ago. The official story was that he'd been caught in a squall and dashed against the rock. But There had been no squall that day. I knew. I had been out on the water myself. I tied off the sea spirit and clambered over the slippery seaweed-covered rocks to get a closer look. The dory's hull was mostly gone, but one section of the thick oak planking intact, facing outward. And on it were marks. They weren't scratches from rocks. Rocks are random, sharp, and chaotic. These were gouges, 3 parallel grooves, deep and wide, each as broad as my 2 hands put together. They had been carved into the wood with unimaginable force, the splinters torn away as if by something impossibly strong and impossibly large. It looked as if a giant had raked its fingers across the boat. Standing there, with the taste of salt on my lips and the sound of the surf in my ears, everything clicked into place. The boiling water, the vanishing deer, the sonar anomaly, my granddad's stories, the snapped chains and the gouges in the wood. I wasn't dealing with a fish, not even a big one. I was standing at the edge of something ancient, a creature that had made this cove its hunting ground for generations, a secret the ocean had kept well. My fear began to change, slowly transmuting into something else. It was a feeling closer to awe. This wasn't a monster to be hunted or a beast to be slain. It was a part of the natural order I had never known existed, a king in a kingdom I had only ever skimmed the surface. And I knew, with a quiet dread that felt like a kind of prayer, that I had to see it through. I needed one final, undeniable proof, if only for myself, not to expose it, but to truly understand the sheer scale of the truth the water was hiding. A plan took root in my mind, not born of arrogance, but of a deep-seated need to bear witness. This wasn't about capturing or conquering. It was about offering a final, respectful test to confirm the scale of the thing I now shared the waters with. It felt like a duty, a final chapter in my long conversation sea. I went to see an old friend, a hog farmer named Alistair, who lived a few miles inland. I didn't tell him why I needed it. He wouldn't have believed me anyway, but I left his farm with the carcass of a 200-pound pig in the back of my truck, wrapped in heavy canvas. The weight of it was a solid, sobering thing. Next, I visited the shipwright's yard down at the commercial docks. From a pile of rusting marine scrap, I bought a length of anchor chain that was anything but scrap. Each link was as thick as my wrist, forged steel, meant to hold a cargo freighter in a storm. It cost me a fair piece of my pension, but it was the only thing I could imagine that stood a chance. Finally, from the harbor master's supply, I procured a single industrial-grade mooring buoy, a bright orange sphere the size of a small armchair, rated to a tensile strength that could stop a runaway truck. My preparations were complete. I had the offering, the line, and the marker. I chose a morning when the moon was a ghost and the tide was slack. Thick, wet fog had rolled in overnight, swallowing the coastline and muffling the world in a blanket of gray silence. It was the kind of morning that feels ancient, like the world is still being formed. The sea spirit cut through the glassy water, the only sound our own engine's low thrum. But he didn't whine this time. He sat pressed against the cabin wall, utterly still, his eyes wide and dark in the gloom. He knew. He could smell the finality in the air, the same way he could smell a storm coming from 100 miles away. I anchored in the heart of the devil's throat. The fog was so dense the cliffs were invisible, making the cove feel like an infinite roofless chamber. The silence. I worked methodically, my hand sure despite the tremor in my soul. I wrapped the chain around the pig carcass, securing it with heavy steel clasps. I shackled the other end to the massive buoy. The whole rig was an absurdity. A hog, a freighter chain, and a commercial buoy, all for ghosts I couldn't even be sure existed. With a final grunt, I heaved the carcass over the side. It landed with a dull, fleshy splash that the fog seemed to absorb instantly. The buoy followed, hitting the water with a hollow thump and bobbing there, a defiant splash of orange in the monochrome world. And then I waited. An hour passed. The fog began to thin as the sun, still hidden, started to warm the air. Patches of gray cliff began to emerge from the mist. A pair of gulls swooped down, circled the buoy curiously, then flew off, their cries sounding thin and distant. Nothing. My heart, which had been a frantic bird in my chest, began to slow. Cold tendril of doubt crept in. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the sonar had glitched. Maybe Reed's boat wrecked. Storm after all. I felt a strange mix of disappointment, found relief. I was about to pull up my anchor and chalk the whole thing up to an old man's fever dream when the buoy didn't bob. It didn't dip. It vanished. It was sucked under the surface with a speed and violence that defied physics. One moment, it was there, a solid point of reference, gray world. The next, it was gone, leaving behind a swirling vortex that looked like a drain hole in the ocean. The chain, which had been lying slack, snapped taut, with a sound like a giant's guitar string being plucked. The tension was so immense that it pulled the stern of the sea spirit down, lifting our bow clear out of the water. I was thrown against the far side of the cabin. The wind knocked out of the chain groaned. It was a deep, resonant, metallic scream of steel being pushed past its breaking point. Water sprayed up from where it sliced through the surface, hissing like 1,000 angry snakes. The entire boat shuddered, timbers groaning in protest. I could feel the power, the impossible tectonic force being exerted from the depths, transmitted through that length of steel. It was not the thrashing of a shark, a panicked run of a whale. It was a steady, deliberate, and irresistible pull, like the entire planet had decided to claim its offering. Then, with a sound that I will hear in my dreams until the day I die, the chain broke. It wasn't a snap. It was an explosion, a deafening crack like a cannon shot that echoed off the newly visible cliffs and rolled out to sea. The broken end of the chain whipped back out of the water, a twisted shrapnel of steel, and slammed against the side of my boat, leaving a deep scar in the wood. The sea spirit lurched back into rocking violently in the suddenly calm, and then silence, a silence deeper and more complete than any I had ever known. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing a calm, sun-dappled cove. The water was glass. There was no buoy, no chain, no carcass, nothing. I sat there for a long time, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands shaking. The fear had been burned out of me by the sheer, clean power of it all. I had my proof. I had touched the face of the abyss, and it had proven to be mightier than I could have ever imagined. In that moment, I understood my place. A guest here, a fleeting visitor on the surface of a world whose true rulers lived in the crushing dark below. I did not become a hunter. I became a guardian. My mission was no longer to understand, to protect the creature from a world that would want to capture, study, or kill it, to protect the world from a secret it was not ready for. I started telling stories. At the docks, at the bait shop, to any young fisherman foolish enough to consider trying his luck in the cove. I exaggerated the tales of the treacherous currents. I invented stories of a hidden boat-gutting reef that only appeared on certain tides. I used my reputation as an old salt who knew these waters to paint the devil's throat as a place of certain doom for any vessel smaller destroyer. The name, once a colorful piece of folklore, became a genuine warning. Slowly, people started to listen, stayed away. Now I sit on my porch and watch the sun painting the water of orange. Buddy lies at his breathing slow and steady. We don't go to the cove anymore. There's no need. I know what I carry the weight of smooth stone. Sometimes, quiet, I look at expanse and feel the sea has shared its greatest secret with, and in return, I will keep it. I am its silent keeper, an old man who looked into the throat of the deep and chose not to shout, but to whisper a warning. If you've enjoyed an old man's rambling, maybe consider the channel. Got more stories. The greatest wisdom lies not in conquering nature's mysteries, but in recognizing that some depths are not meant to be plumbed, And some secrets are not ours to reveal, but to protect. Did this story hook you? Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell. You'll become part of our crew, sharing stories that explore the deep, forgotten corners of our world.